The police arrived within the hour, their arrival marked by the grinding of gravel beneath heavy tires and the purposeful closing of car doors that seemed to echo across the frost-stiffened lawns. Inspector Graves was a man of perhaps 60, with the weary demeanor of someone who had investigated too many crimes in too many small villages and had grown tired of the predictable nature of human wickedness. Behind him came Sergeant Willis, a younger man with the eager expression of someone still believing that police work involved more than cataloguing the petty resentments that festered beneath respectability. Miss Marple observed their arrival from her position by the window, noting with quiet satisfaction that the inspector paused before entering Thornfield to examine the ground near the drive. She had been correct then. The frost had preserved its evidence well. By noon, the drawing room at Thornfield had become something of an unofficial command center, though Inspector Graves seemed to have little use for Miss Marple's presence beyond a polite acknowledgement that she was a house guest of the Ashford family. He was the sort of policeman who believed that solutions came from following procedure rather than understanding people, which Miss Marple found both limiting and, paradoxically, quite useful to her own investigations. Charlotte Blackwood lay in the village hospital, still unconscious, her condition described by Dr. Hartley as grave, but not yet hopeless. She had suffered a severe blow to the back of her head, consistent with a heavy implement delivered with considerable force. There were no signs of robbery, no obvious motive beyond the equally obvious fact that someone had wished her significant harm. Inspector Graves sat across from Edward Blackwood, with the demeanor of a man who had already decided upon guilt and merely required the formality of confession. "You quarreled with your wife last evening," he stated, consulting his notebook as though verifying facts already established beyond doubt. "A disagreement," Edward corrected, his fingers twisting together with increasing agitation. "About her mother's intended visit." "Nothing more, nothing more," the inspector repeated, in that particular tone that transformed a statement into an accusation. "And yet this morning she was found beaten senseless, ostensibly during a solitary walk taken without informing you of her destination. Convenient, wouldn't you say?" It was Miss Marple, observing from her position near the bookshelf where she had settled with her knitting, who noted the subtle error in the inspector's logic. Charlotte Blackwood, from what Mrs. Kemp had mentioned when Ruth had pressed her for details, was not accustomed to solitary walks. Indeed, Mrs. Kemp had specifically remarked that young Mrs. Blackwood was rather a creature of habit, preferring the comfort of the house and the company of her newly appointed lady's maid to the vagaries of the English countryside. But the inspector was not interested in such nuances. He was interested in motive and opportunity, and Edward Blackwood possessed both in ample measure. It was Ruth who insisted that Miss Marple be present when Inspector Graves began interviewing the household staff and the villagers who might have seen something of relevance. "My cousin has a gift," Ruth had said firmly, with the kind of conviction that comes from years of observing someone's accuracy in the small matters of human nature. "You would do well to attend to her observations, Inspector, however inconsequential they might initially appear." The inspector had smiled indulgently, the sort of smile one bestows upon elderly ladies prone to flights of fancy, but he had not objected to her presence. It was during the interview with Mrs. Kemp that the first genuinely interesting detail emerged. When asked whether she had observed anyone approaching the southern border of the grounds during the early morning hours, Mrs. Kemp hesitated, barely perceptibly, but enough for Miss Marple to notice. "There may have been someone," Mrs. Kemp finally said, her weathered hands gripping the fabric of her apron, "near the stone wall. But I could not say for certain. The light was poor and the frost made everything rather indistinct." "Describe them," the inspector commanded. "Only a figure, wearing dark clothing, I believe, moving rather hurriedly toward or away from the house." "Away," Mrs. Kemp said, and Miss Marple observed the slight tremor in her voice. "Definitely away." This detail seemed to gratify the inspector considerably, as it provided a corroborating narrative to the story of Edward Blackwood's guilt. A man arguing with his wife, growing increasingly furious, following her out into the morning cold, striking her down in a moment of violent passion. The bootprints in the frost, several sets according to Mrs. Kemp's initial description, could be attributed to the various people who had discovered her, But as Miss Marple considered the sequence of events, several small inconsistencies began to accumulate in her mind like frost crystals forming upon a window pane. The bootprints, Mrs. Kemp had said, were quite distinct in the frozen grass. The violence of the blow suggested considerable force, yet Charlotte Blackwood was described as strong and athletic. A struggle would be expected, yet her fingernails showed no signs of defensive wounds. And then there was the curious matter of Charlotte's walking habits, and the fact that she had apparently left the house without her coat, despite the bitter cold. Miss Marple had asked this seemingly innocent question of Mrs. Kemp, and had noticed the way the older woman's jaw had tightened at the query. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the frost-covered grounds, Miss Marple excused herself and requested permission to examine the scene where Charlotte had been discovered. The inspector, secure in his conviction of Edward's guilt, granted this with the same indulgent smile, presumably grateful that the elderly lady would soon satisfy her curiosity and depart to her needlework. But Miss Marple's examination of the ground told a very different story than the one Inspector Graves believed he had uncovered. And as she knelt carefully in the frost, her aged eyes scanning the evidence preserved in ice and frozen earth, she began to perceive the true shape of the crime that had disrupted the peace of Little Brackenham. The stone wall that bordered the southern edge of Thornfield's grounds had stood for nearly 2 centuries, its grey surface weathered by countless winters into a landscape of cracks and soft moss. It was here, in a depression formed by the settling earth and the encroaching bracken, that Charlotte Blackwood had been discovered. Miss Marple knelt with the careful precision of someone accustomed to her body's limitations, her gloved fingers brushing away the remnants of frost to examine the ground beneath. Sergeant Willis hovered nearby with the anxious expression of a young man, uncertain whether to assist an elderly lady or prevent her from contaminating a crime scene. He settled for merely watching, his notebook forgotten in his pocket. The bootprints were indeed distinct, though not in the manner the inspector had assumed. There were 4 separate sets, each with particular characteristics that Miss Marple's years of observation allow her to interpret with reasonable accuracy. One set, the largest, with a distinctive heel mark suggesting a man's work boot, appeared multiple times, suggesting pacing rather than purposeful movement. Another set was lighter, narrower, consistent with a woman's shoe of a smaller size than Charlotte Blackwood's own. A third set bore the marks of recent polishing, the kind of careful maintenance one found in households where standards of appearance were strictly maintained. But it was the 4th set that commanded Miss Marple's attention. These prints were deeper than the others, suggesting either greater weight or deeper distress in the walker's gait. Moreover, they appeared to move in a direct line from the direction of the stable buildings, rather than from the house proper. "The prints tell quite a story, don't they?" Miss Marple remarked quietly, straightening with Willis's assistance. "One might almost imagine a gathering, rather than an isolated incident. Multiple people converging on this particular spot, all within a relatively brief span of time." Willis appeared momentarily flustered. "The inspector suggested there would be disturbance from the discovery itself, madam. Multiple people approaching once the alarm was raised." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed, though her tone suggested she disagreed entirely. "Though I confess I find it curious that the deepest prints, the ones suggesting the most recent or forceful passage, led away from the stable buildings rather than from the house. One would expect the opposite, wouldn't one, if this were truly a crime of passion committed by the master of the house?" She left Willis to contemplate this observation and returned toward Thornfield proper, her mind already constructing alternative narratives to the one Inspector Graves had so eagerly embraced. As she walked, she found herself reflecting upon a case from her own village of St. Mary Mead, some 15 years prior. A young woman had been struck down in remarkably similar circumstances, and the obvious suspect, her husband, had indeed been innocent. The true perpetrator had been someone far more subtle, far more motivated by considerations beyond simple marital discord. The key to that case had been a detail no one else had thought to examine: the victim's clothing, specifically what she had not been wearing. By the time Miss Marple reached the servants' entrance to Thornfield, she had formed a theory sufficiently coherent to guide her next inquiries. She found Mrs. Kemp in the small room adjacent to the kitchens, where she habitually took her afternoon tea, a privilege earned through decades of loyal service. "Mrs. Kemp," Miss Marple said, settling herself in the offered chair with the grace of someone not at all disturbed by the slight stiffening that occurred in the older woman's shoulders. "I have been thinking about your early morning walk, the one during which you discovered poor Mrs. Blackwood." "I've already told the inspector everything I observed," Mrs. Kemp said, her voice tight. "There is nothing further to discuss." "I'm quite certain there is," Miss Marple replied gently. "You see, I've been considering the bootprints, all of them, and I've been wondering about the sequence of events. You discovered Mrs. Blackwood quite early, you said, before the household had fully awakened." "Just after dawn," Mrs. Kemp confirmed, her hands gripping her cup with rather more force than seemed necessary. "I always walk the grounds first thing. It's my habit." "As it would be," Miss Marple agreed. "And Mr. Blackwood, I understand, rode out shortly after." "In pursuit of you, or so he claimed. I couldn't say what Mr. Blackwood's intentions were." "No," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "But you could say, perhaps, whether you saw him leave tea, house, whether you observed him saddling his horse, whether his clothing bore the mud and frost consistent with a morning ride." Mrs. Kemp set down her cup with a sharp clink. "I don't see what business this is of yours, Miss Marple. Mrs. Blackwood is a kind woman. Whatever befell her, she didn't deserve it." "I'm quite in agreement," Miss Marple said gently, "which is precisely why I intend to discover who truly inflicted that harm upon her. And I suspect, Mrs. Kemp, that you possess information crucial to that discovery, though perhaps you do not fully comprehend its significance." The older woman's composure wavered visibly. "There are matters, personal matters, that should perhaps remain private. Matters of loyalty and discretion. There are indeed," Miss Marple acknowledged. "But when those matters intersect with violence, they cease to be merely personal. Tell me, Mrs. Kemp, who did you see near the stable buildings this morning, before you discovered Charlotte?" Mrs. Kemp's jaw tightened, and for a long moment silence hung between them like frost suspended in winter air. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was the vicar's son," she said. "Young Thomas. He was leaving the stable and his clothing was torn, and there was blood on his sleeve. When I asked him what had happened, he said he'd been mucking out the stalls and had scraped himself on a nail. But he was lying, Miss Marple. I've known Thomas Ashworth since he was born, and I know when he's lying." Miss Marple felt a familiar settling sensation, the moment when chaos began to arrange itself into coherence. "Thomas Ashworth," she repeated, filing this information alongside other details she had gathered throughout the day. "The vicar's son recently returned from London, where he had secured an excellent position. Yes, I believe I met him briefly at dinner last evening. A charming young man, with very particular expectations about his future." And, as she left Mrs. Kemp to her troubled thoughts, Miss Marple began to perceive the true nature of the crime that had brought violence to Little Brackenham. It was not, as Inspector Graves believed, a matter of simple marital discord. It was something far more complex, rooted in ambition, resentment, and the particular cruelties that the young sometimes inflicted upon those who stood between them and their desires. The vicarage stood on the northern edge of Little Brackenham, a substantial Victorian structure surrounded by well-maintained gardens that spoke of both prosperity and careful attention to propriety. It was here that Miss Marple directed her steps as the afternoon light began its descent toward evening, her mind already assembling the pieces of a puzzle that most would have considered complete hours ago. Thomas Ashworth had been away in London for nearly 3 years, having secured a position with a respected publishing firm that promised to launch him into a life of considerable comfort and social elevation. His return to the village, according to the gossip Ruth had shared during tea, had been unexpected. He had arrived without explanation and had taken up residence in his family home once more, a development that had occasioned considerable speculation among those inclined toward such inquiries. The vicar himself, Reverend Ashworth, was in his study when Miss Marple arrived, a man of perhaps 60 with the austere features of someone who had spent his life mediating between divine judgment and human weakness. He received her with the courtesy due to a respectable visitor, though his expression suggested he was not entirely comfortable with unannounced calls, particularly from ladies of Miss Marple's evident purpose. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion," Miss Marple began, settling hers. LF in the offered chair with her characteristic grace. "I find myself troubled by recent events, Reverend, and I thought perhaps you might be able to clarify a matter that has been occupying my thoughts. I assure you, Miss Marple, that my family has nothing to do with the tragedy at Thornfield," the vicar said stiffly. "Whatever misfortune has befallen Mrs. Blackwood, I can scarce imagine how we might be implicated." "I'm quite certain you cannot," Miss Marple agreed, with that particular gentleness that somehow managed to convey contradiction. "Though I confess I am curious about your son's recent movements. He has been home for some weeks now, I understand, after an extended absence." The vicar's composure remained steady, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening around his eyes. "Thomas has indeed returned to the village. His employment in London concluded, and he felt it time to settle nearer to family." This was not, Miss Marple suspected, the entire truth. She had observed during her brief acquaintance with Thomas the night before that he possessed the particular, nervous energy of someone engaged in deception. Moreover, she had noticed how his eyes had lingered upon Charlotte Blackwood during dinner, and more particularly, how Charlotte had deliberately avoided meeting his gaze. "How very fortunate," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Though I imagine it must have been somewhat awkward for him, returning to his childhood home after tasting the wider world. These young men often struggle with such transitions, don't they? The provincial life can seem quite constraining after London's attractions." The vicar rose and moved toward the window, a gesture that Miss Marple recognized as indicative of discomfort. "Thomas has always been dutiful about his responsibilities to his family and his faith." "I'm certain he has," Miss Marple said, "though duty and desire don't always align neatly, do they? Particularly when a young man of ambition finds himself thwarted in his expectations. Tell me, Reverend, does Thomas still intend to return to London? To his position with the publishing firm?" There was a long pause. When the vicar finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its certainty. "That position is no longer available to him. His employer felt that there were certain circumstances that made continued employment inadvisable." "Circumstances," Miss Marple repeated gently. "Would these circumstances by any chance involve a woman?" The vicar turned back to face her, and Miss Marple saw in his expression the weight of a father who has discovered his son capable of serious transgression. "I don't see how this is any concern of yours, Miss Marple." "It's not, ordinarily," Miss Marple acknowledged. "But when a young woman is struck down, and when a young man appears at the scene bearing evidence of violence, then the circumstances that drove him to that moment become quite relevant indeed. You see, Reverend, I have spent many years observing human nature, and I have learned that violence rarely occurs in isolation. It is always the culmination of smaller betrayals, smaller resentments, smaller humiliations that accumulate until someone finally breaks." She rose to her feet with deliberate slowness, allowing the weight of her years and her certainty to settle upon the room. "I believe your son made an error in judgment while in London. I believe this error involved a woman of some social standing, a woman whose family had the power to ensure that Thomas's reputation was thoroughly destroyed. I believe that when he returned to the village, he discovered that this woman, Charlotte Blackwood, had followed him here, presumably because her husband had secured a position that brought him to this county. And I believe that Thomas, in his desperation, attempted to silence her." The vicar's face had gone quite pale. "You cannot prove any of this." "I'm quite aware that I cannot," Miss Marple said. "But Inspector Graves will, once he understands what to look for. The torn clothing," Mrs. Kemp observed, "the blood upon his sleeve, the bootprints leading from the stable, all of these things will tell their own story once properly interpreted. And, I suspect, if one were to examine your son's correspondence from London, one would find evidence of the entanglement that drove him to such desperate action." She moved toward the door, then paused. "The tragic element, of course, is that Charlotte Blackwood may well survive her injuries. And if she does, her testimony will be far more damaging to Thomas's case than any circumstantial evidence I might present. He struck her in anger and in panic, hoping to silence her permanently. But violence, Reverend, unlike so many other human failings, cannot be undone through contrition or prayer. As Miss Marple stepped out into the gathering dusk, she heard behind her the sound of the vicar sinking into his chair, the weight of paternal knowledge settling upon him like a stone. Somewhere in the house, she knew, Thomas was likely preparing his defense, constructing explanations that would crumble under the slightest scrutiny. The evidence was mounting, and soon even Inspector Graves would be forced to acknowledge that his initial theory had been erected upon false foundations. But the matter was not quite concluded. There remained certain details that did not quite align with the narrative she had presented to the vicar, small inconsistencies that nagged at her perception like a loose thread in an otherwise complete tapestry. The village hospital occupied a modest Victorian building on the high street, its windows lit against the encroaching darkness of the December evening. Miss Marple arrived there shortly after leaving the vicarage, her purpose ostensibly to inquire after Charlotte Blackwood's condition, though in reality she sought something far more specific. Dr. Hartley, a competent if somewhat unimaginative man of 50, greeted her with the professional courtesy he extended to all respectable visitors. "Mrs. Blackwood remains unconscious," he informed her, gesturing toward the private room where Charlotte lay. "The blow to her head was severe, but I am cautiously optimistic about her prospects for recovery. Another inch to the left, and the outcome would have been quite different." Miss Marple nodded, absorbing this information while her keen eyes swept across the room. Charlotte lay still beneath white linen, a bandage wrapped about her head, her face peaceful in unconsciousness. But it was not Charlotte's condition that drew Miss Marple's attention. Rather, it was the curious absence of certain things one might have expected to find. "Her personal effects?" Miss Marple inquired. "Her jewelry, her handbag, the items she would have carried during her morning walk?" Dr. Hartley appeared momentarily confused by this line of inquiry. "Her husband brought in a dressing gown and some toiletries for her recovery. As for what she was wearing when discovered, I believe those items are with the police." "Of course," Miss Marple said, though her mind was already pursuing a new thread of reasoning. "Tell me, doctor, when Mrs. Blackwood was brought in, was she wearing her wedding ring?" The question seemed to strike the doctor as peculiar, but he considered it seriously. "I'm not entirely certain," he admitted. "There was mud upon her hands, and her fingers were quite cold. The ring may have been removed as part of the initial examination. You would need to inquire with Inspector Graves." But Miss Marple was already moving toward the door. Our intuition suggesting that the missing ring was far more significant than Dr. Hartley's casual dismissal implied. She made her way to the police station, a modest brick building that served as the administrative center for the village's constabulary, where she found Sergeant Willis organizing the evidence gathered from the crime scene. The sergeant looked up at her approach with the expression of someone accustomed to being interrupted by elderly ladies with uninvited observations. "Miss Marple," he said, setting down a ledger, "I'm afraid the inspector is not currently available. He's taken a statement from Mr. Blackwood and is preparing the preliminary charges." "Charges?" Miss Marple's voice remained calm, though her eyes sharpened considerably. "Against whom, Sergeant?" "Against Edward Blackwood, naturally. The evidence is quite conclusive. His quarrel with his wife, his lack of alibi, the motive—" "Yes," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "though I wonder if you have examined all the evidence with equal care. Tell me, what was Mrs. Blackwood wearing when she was discovered?" Willis consulted his notes. "A day dress of dark blue wool, according to the initial report, mud-stained, torn at the hem. Her shoes were missing." "Missing," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "And yet the boot prints in the frost were quite distinct. Tell me, Sergeant, when one walks through frost and mud, does one not typically lose one's shoes in a struggle? Or does one remove them deliberately, leaving them behind as evidence of one's passage?" Willis frowned. "I'm not entirely sure I follow your meaning, Miss Marple." "Then allow me to be more direct," she said. "I wish to examine Mrs. Blackwood's dress, specifically the tears in the fabric. Are they consistent with a violent struggle, or do they suggest something altogether different? The sergeant, uncertain of his authority but relu. Seatant, to refuse a woman of Miss Marple's obvious respectability, retrieved the evidence bag containing Charlotte's clothing. Together they examined the torn hem, and Miss Marple's suspicions crystallized into something approaching certainty. The tears were too regular, too deliberate. They were not the ragged rents one would expect from violent contact with rough stone or grasping hands. These tears appeared to have been made with deliberate intent, perhaps with a knife or sharp instrument, as though someone had wished the dress to appear more damaged than it actually was. "Sergeant," Miss Marple said carefully, "I would like to know whether anyone examined Mrs. Blackwood's hands for evidence of defensive wounds, whether her fingernails bore traces of skin or blood, whether she displayed any signs of having struggled with her attacker." Willis consulted his notes again, his expression growing increasingly uncertain. The doctor's report makes no mention of such findings. In fact, it states that her hands showed no signs of resistance, which is most curious, Miss Marple observed, for a woman of Mrs. Blackwood's evident strength and vitality to be struck senseless without raising a hand to defend herself. Unless, of course, she was not struggling. Unless, perhaps, the blow was delivered by someone she trusted, someone she was not expecting to harm her. The implications of this statement hung in the air between them. Sergeant Willis's face had gone quite pale, the certainty of the investigation's direction suddenly crumbling like plaster beneath the weight of new consideration. "You're suggesting," he said slowly, "that it was not Mr. Blackwood." "I am suggesting," Miss Marple said, "that the evidence pointing toward Mr. Blackwood's guilt was perhaps too convenient, too perfectly aligned with the narrative that Inspector Graves wished to construct. And I am suggesting, and further, that if you examine Mrs. Blackwood's personal effects, her wedding ring in particular, and any jewelry she may have been wearing, you will discover evidence of a very different crime than the one you are currently preparing to prosecute." She rose to her feet, her aged frame suddenly seeming to straighten with purpose. "I believe, Sergeant Willis, that you should telephone the hospital and inquire whether Mrs. Blackwood has regained consciousness. And I believe that you should be prepared, when she does, to ask her some rather pointed questions about the identity of her attacker, and more importantly, about what she may have been doing in the company of that attacker when the violence occurred." Willis stared at her, confusion and dawning comprehension warring across his features. And in that moment, Miss Marple knew that the investigation was about to take a turn that would surprise everyone except herself, who had long since learned that the most dangerous secrets in small villages were rarely the ones everyone assumed them to be. Charlotte Blackwood regained consciousness at approximately 9 o'clock that evening, her eyes fluttering open with the tentative uncertainty of someone returning from a great distance. Dr. Hartley summoned Inspector Graves immediately, though not before Miss Marple, who had remained at the hospital with the persistence of someone convinced of her usefulness, had managed a brief private word with the patient. "Tell me," Miss Marple said gently, taking Charlotte's hand in her own cool fingers, "was it Thomas Ashworth who struck you?" Charlotte's eyes widened with alarm, and her fingers gripped Miss Marple's with surprising strength for someone supposedly on the brink of death. "How could you possibly—" she began, then stopped, her face crumpling with what appeared to be equal parts fear and relief. "Because," Miss Marple said quietly, "I have been observing human nature for nearly 83 years, and I have learned to recognize the particular constellation of circumstances that leads to violence. Now, before the inspector arrives, I must ask you a crucial question. Were you and Thomas Ashworth engaged in an affair?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Charlotte turned her face toward the window, tears beginning to slide down her cheeks, though whether from pain or emotion Miss Marple could not definitively determine. "We knew each other in London," Charlotte finally whispered, "before I married Edward. Thomas he was everything I thought I wanted, ambitious, charming, attentive. But his family had no money, and my father was quite firm about the match with Edward. Edward was already established, already secure. I thought I was making the sensible choice, "But Thomas followed you here," Miss Marple prompted, understanding now the sequence of events that had brought violence to the frost-covered grounds of Thornfield. "He wrote to me. Constantly. At first I didn't respond. But he was so persistent, so certain that we belonged together. And then, when his position in London fell through, there was some scandal involving his employer's daughter, I believe. He came here. He said he couldn't bear to see me unhappy. He said Edward didn't deserve me." Miss Marple's expression remained composed, though her mind was rapidly reconstructing the timeline of events. "And this morning, he asked me to meet him near the stone wall. He said he had secured a new position, that we could run away together, that everything could be different. I went because I was curious, I suppose, because part of me wondered what my life might have been if I had chosen differently." "And Edward?" Miss Marple asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Edward followed me. He had suspected something was amiss. He arrived just as Thomas was, as he was becoming insistent, more insistent than he had been in his letters. When I refused him, when I told him that I loved my husband and would not leave, Thomas became angry, violently angry. He said I had used him, that I had led him on, that I owed him something for the sacrifices he had made." Charlotte paused, her hand trembling in Miss Marple's grip. I turned to run back to the house, back to Edward, but Thomas grabbed my arm, and there was a rock near the wall, and he picked it up, and he struck me. I remember the pain, and then nothing. When I woke in the hospital, I saw Edward's face, and I knew he had found me. It was at this precise moment that Inspector Graves entered, his expression immediately transforming from professional courtesy to sharp inquiry upon observing Miss Marple's intimate positioning beside the patient's bedside. "I trust you have not been tampering with a witness, Miss Marple," he said, his tone suggesting this was precisely what he suspected. "I have merely been offering what comfort an elderly lady might provide," Miss Marple replied calmly, releasing Charlotte's hand. "Though I believe Mrs. Blackwood is now prepared to tell you the truth regarding her attacker. A truth, I might add, that differs considerably from the narrative you have been constructing." What followed was a confession that thoroughly dismantled Inspector Graves's carefully assembled case. Charlotte, with increasing confidence as she spoke, described her history with Thomas Ashworth, her attempted rejection of him, and the violence that had erupted when he refused to accept her refusal. She described how Edward, following her out into the morning cold, had arrived to find her lying bleeding upon the ground, Thomas standing over her with the rock still in his hand. Edward fought with him, Charlotte expla. In Ned, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. They struggled, and Edward managed to push Thomas away from me. Thomas ran toward the stable buildings. Edward stayed with me, held me, kept me warm until help arrived. Inspector Graves's face had gone quite red, the implications of his error becoming increasingly apparent. "Why did Mr. Blackwood not simply tell us this?" he demanded. "Why did he allow himself to be placed under suspicion?" "Because," Miss Marple said quietly, "he had no witnesses to the struggle with Thomas. Because the evidence of torn clothing and general violence could be interpreted as consistent with domestic dispute. Because he was, perhaps, thinking of his wife's reputation and the scandal that would inevitably follow if the true nature of her relationship with Thomas became public knowledge. Men will often sacrifice their own interests to protect those they love, Inspector. It is one of the more admirable aspects of human nature, even when it leads them into considerable difficulty." Charlotte began to weep in earnest then, the emotional weight of the morning's events finally overwhelming her fragile composure. Dr. Hartley moved to attend to her, his expression suggesting that he had concerns about the advisability of continued questioning. Inspector Graves, his earlier certainty entirely evaporated, turned to Miss Marple with an expression that mingled gratitude with considerable chagrin. "I believe, Miss Marple, that I owe you an apology, and an explanation as to how you perceived what I overlooked." "The explanation," Miss Marple said, collecting her handbag with the deliberate movements of advanced age, "is quite simple. You looked for the most obvious motive, the most apparent suspect. I, on the other hand, looked for inconsistencies, for details that did not align with the narrative, for the small betrayals of human nature that suggest a more complex truth than the one initially presented. As she departed the hospital and stepped out into the cold December night, Miss Marple found herself reflecting upon the curious nature of the crime that had disrupted little Brackenham. It was not, ultimately, a matter of a husband's jealous rage, though Inspector Graves had been quite willing to accept such a narrative. It was, rather, a tragedy born of impossible choices, of young ambition meeting older love, of the collision between what one wished one's life to be and the reality of what one's life actually was. Thomas Ashworth would soon be apprehended, his crime beyond dispute. But the true victim of this morning's violence was not merely Charlotte, but all of them, caught in the web of consequence that human weakness inevitably spun. Thomas Ashworth was apprehended at the railway station shortly after midnight, attempting to board a train bound for London with nothing but a single suitcase and whatever currency he had managed to gather in his frantic hours of flight. Inspector Graves, his professional pride thoroughly wounded and his determination to redeem himself considerably strengthened, had issued the arrest warrant with a speed that suggested he was eager to demonstrate competence, even if that competence had arrived rather late in the investigation. Miss Marple learned of the arrest the following morning when Ruth presented her with the village newspaper, the headline announcing the dramatic turn of events in bold, sensationalized lettering. She set the paper aside with the philosophical acceptance of someone accustomed to the public's insatiable appetite for scandal, and instead directed her attention toward the more pressing matter of understanding what had truly transpired during those crucial hours of the preceding morning. It was Ruth who insisted that they visit Thomas Ashworth's family home to extend their condolences to the vicar and his wife, a gesture that Miss Marple recognized as simultaneously compassionate and strategically useful. The Reverend Ashworth received them in his study with the demeanor of a man whose world had fundamentally shifted, whose assumptions about his own son had been irrevocably altered by the revelation of Thomas's capacity for violence. "I do not understand," the vicar said, his voice hollow with the particular anguish of parental disappointment, "how I failed to perceive this darkness in him. I raised him in the faith. I taught him principles of honor and restraint. Yet he became someone capable of striking down a woman in fury. The darkness was not always present," Miss Marple said gently, settling herself with her characteristic grace. "It accumulated gradually, like frost upon a window, until it obscured everything beneath it. Thomas Ashworth was an ambitious young man of considerable talent, but his ambition was constrained by circumstances beyond his control. His family's modest means, his position as the vicar's son with all the attendant expectations of propriety, the social barriers that prevented him from ascending to the stations his abilities might have warranted. All of these things created a particular species of resentment." She paused, allowing her words to settle in the heavy silence of the study. And then he encountered Charlotte Blackwood, who represented everything his ambition craved: beauty, social position, the promise of entry into a world that his birth had denied him. When that promise was withdrawn, when Charlotte chose security over love, the resentment transformed into something far more dangerous. The vicar's wife, who had remained largely silent until this point, spoke with the peculiar certainty of someone who had spent long hours contemplating her son's actions. He came home in a state of agitation when his position in London was terminated. There was some business involving the employer's daughter, though Thomas would never provide the details. He said his prospects had been ruined through no fault of his own, that the world was deliberately conspiring against him. "The employer's daughter," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "I wonder if Thomas's attentions toward that young woman were perhaps as unwelcome as his recent attentions toward Charlotte have proven to be. Some men struggle to accept rejection, particularly when their sense of themselves depends upon their romantic success." The observation hung in the air like an indictment, and Miss Marple perceived the moment when the vicar and his wife fully grasped the true nature of their son's character, not as a sudden aberration, but as a manifestation of qualities that had always existed, merely dormant until circumstances inflamed them. It was as Miss Marple and Ruth were departing the vicarage that Sergeant Willis appeared on the doorstep, his expression suggesting he had been pursuing them with some urgency. "Miss Marple," he said, slightly breathless from exertion, "the inspector requests your presence at the station. There's been a development regarding the case." The police station was a modest affair, but its single interrogation room had been transformed into something resembling a theatre of confrontation. Inspector Graves sat opposite Thomas Ashworth, who looked considerably less charming in the harsh morning light than he had during their dinner conversation. 2 evenings prior, his face bore the marks of a sleepless night, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. "I've asked Miss Marple to attend," Inspector Graves explained, with the air of a man extending an olive branch to someone who had demonstrated superior deductive abilities, "because there is a matter that requires clarification. Mr. Ashworth insists that he did not strike Mrs. Blackwood. He claims that when he and Mrs. Blackwood were interrupted by her husband at the stone wall, they were engaged in conversation, nothing more. He further claims that it was Edward Blackwood himself who struck the blow, in a fit of jealous rage." Miss Marple absorbed this information without visible surprise, though her mind was already cataloguing the implications. "And what evidence does Mr. Ashworth possess to support this assertion?" she inquired. "He claims," Inspector Graves said, his frustration evident, "that he has a witness, someone who observed the entire exchange." "Mrs. Kemp," Thomas said suddenly, his eyes fixed upon Miss Marple with the intensity of desperation. "She was in the area. She saw everything. She saw Edward arrive, saw him become enraged when he discovered us together. She saw him pick up the rock. It was a clever strategy," Miss Marple reflected, "to introduce doubt, to suggest that perhaps the investigation had been pursued too eagerly toward a convenient conclusion. But it was also a strategy born of fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of evidence and the reliability of human observation. Mrs. Kemp," Miss Marple said quietly, "has already provided her statement to the police. She observed multiple people near the stone wall during the critical hours, but she was quite clear about the sequence of events. She saw you, Mr. Ashworth, and she saw the violence that you inflicted upon Mrs. Blackwood. She saw you strike her with the rock that lay near the wall. And she saw you flee toward the stable buildings when Mr. Blackwood arrived." Thomas's composure fractured then, his carefully constructed narrative crumbling as he recognized that his attempt to shift blame had failed. "She provoked me," he said, his voice rising with renewed anger. "She led me on, made me believe we might have a future together, and then cast me aside like something discarded. I deserved better. You deserve," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "precisely what the law determines you deserve, Mr. Ashworth, which is considerably less than you apparently believe yourself entitled to." As she rose to depart the interrogation room, Miss Marple reflected that this was often the nature of crime in small villages, not the grand tragedies of literature, but rather the petty resentments of ordinary people who believed themselves exceptional, whose wounded pride had transformed into violence, whose inability to accept rejection had erupted into genuine harm. The mystery of Thornfield Manor was solved, but the deeper mystery of human weakness remained as impenetrable as ever. The days that followed the arrest of Thomas Ashworth passed with the peculiar slowness of winter in the English countryside, as though the village itself had been suspended in time, pending the resolution of the crime that had disrupted its peace. Miss Marple remained at Thornfield, ostensibly to provide companionship to Ruth, though in reality she found herself increasingly drawn toward understanding the full implications of what had transpired, implications that extended far beyond the simple narrative of a young man's violence. It was Edward Blackwood who sought her out on the afternoon of the 22nd of December, 4 days after Thomas's arrest. He found her in the morning room of Thornfield Manor, where she was engaged in her customary occupation of knitting, her needles moving with the rhythmic precision of long practice. "Miss Marple," he said, his manner suggesting considerable internal struggle, "I find myself in need of advice of a peculiar nature, and from someone whose discretion and understanding I have come to trust." Miss Marple gestured toward the chair opposite her, her expression remaining perfectly composed. "Please sit. I suspect there are matters regarding your wife's condition that are troubling you beyond the immediate trauma of the attack." Edward lowered himself into the offered chair with the careful movements of someone bearing an invisible weight. "How did you perceive this?" he asked. "Because," Miss Marple said, not pausing in her knitting, "I have observed that when violence enters a marriage, Even violence perpetrated by a third party, it often illuminates truths that both parties have been avoiding. Charlotte and you were not entirely happy before Thomas Ashworth's reappearance, were you? The directness of the question seemed to shake Edward's remaining composure. He sat in silence for a long moment before responding. "We were content," he finally said. "Or at least, I believed we were. Charlotte presented herself as happy. She fulfilled her duties as my wife with apparent diligence. But there was always something withheld, some part of herself that remained separate from me. And now," Miss Marple continued gently, "that separation has become impossible to ignore. Charlotte's infidelity, her emotional entanglement with another man, these things cannot be simply forgotten or set aside." "No," Edward agreed bitterly, "and yet I find myself unable to condemn her. She was struck down, nearly murdered. Our marriage difficulties seem trivial in comparison to her suffering, and yet I cannot simply resume our life as though nothing has changed." Miss Marple sat down, her knitting with deliberate care. "Tell me, Mr. Blackwood, when you arrived at the stone wall and discovered your wife in Thomas Ashworth's company, what precisely did you observe? Did you see violence, or did you see something else?" Edward's hands clenched into fists. "I saw them standing together, close together. I saw them in attitudes that suggested intimacy. I saw his hand upon her arm, and then, when I called out, when I made my presence known, he became enraged. He accused Charlotte of having betrayed him, of having used him. And when she refused his demands, when she turned away from him, he picked up the rock and struck her. And you," Miss Marple said, "attempted to intervene." "I did. We struggled. He was younger and stronger, but I was driven by rage and the desperate need to protect my wife. Eventually he broke away and fled. I remained with Charlotte, held her, kept her warm until help could be summoned. It was a narrative that aligned precisely with the one Charlotte had provided, and yet Miss Marple perceived in Edward's recounting a certain hesitation, a subtle reluctance in his recollection of specific details. She set down her knitting entirely and regarded him with the full force of her attention. "There is something you have not told the police," she said quietly. "Something that troubles your conscience and prevents you from moving forward with your marriage." Edward rose abruptly and moved toward the window, his back to Miss Marple as he gazed out toward the frost-covered grounds. "When I found them together," he said, his voice barely audible, "I was angry in a way I have never been angry before. I wanted to strike him, to beat him senseless for daring to touch my wife, and for a moment I was not certain I could control that rage." "But you did control it," Miss Marple observed. "Yes, but only barely. If he had not fled, if the struggle between us had continued, I believe I might have been capable of killing him, and that realization, it has forced me to contemplate what manner of man I truly am." Miss Marple considered this confession with the gravity it deserved. "The capacity for violence exists within all of us, Mr. Blackwood. It is a consequence of our passionate nature, our capacity for love and loyalty. What separates the civilized man from the beast is not the absence of that capacity, but the ability to recognize it and to constrain it. You recognized your rage, and you constrained it. That is precisely what makes you a better man than Thomas Ashworth will ever be." Edward turned back to face her, and Miss Marple perceived in his expression the beginning of peace, the tentative acceptance of his own humanity. "Do you believe my marriage can survive this?" he asked. "That," Miss Marple said carefully, "depends entirely upon Charlotte, and upon whether you are both willing to address the truths that this violence has exposed. Marriages that endure difficult trials often emerge stronger, provided both parties are committed to the work of reconstruction. But that commitment must be genuine on both sides. You cannot simply resume your former life and expect the fissures to seal themselves." She retrieved her knitting once more. "I would suggest, Mr. Blackwood, that you and Charlotte engage in genuine conversation about your marriage, about your expectations and disappointments, about the ways in which you have both failed each other. The tragedy that has occurred may yet prove to be the catalyst for genuine intimacy, if you are both willing to embrace that possibility." As Edward departed, leaving Miss Marple to her needlework, she reflected upon the curious irony that violence often illuminated the truths that ordinary civility conspired to obscure. The attack upon Charlotte Blackwood had forced both husband and wife to confront realities they had been avoiding. Realities about desire, about resentment, about the fundamental gap between appearance and actuality that existed in even the most respectable of marriages. The mystery was solved. The criminal had been apprehended, but the true work of healing and understanding remained to be accomplished by those whose lives had been forever altered by the violence that had erupted in the frost grass of Little Brackenham. Christmas came to Little Brackenham with all the traditional pageantry of an English village determined to maintain normalcy in the face of scandal. The church was decorated with holly and ivy, the choir practiced their carols with renewed diligence, and the shopkeepers displayed their wares with the careful attention of those aware that the village's appetite for gossip had been temporarily satiated by actual crime. Miss Marple attended the Christmas Eve service, observing with her characteristic acuteness how the community distributed itself within the pews, noting which families sat in deliberate separation from others, which neighbors exchanged glances laden with unspoken commentary. The vicar's sermon that evening was constructed with remarkable care, touching upon themes of forgiveness and redemption without directly addressing the scandal that had consumed the parish's attention. Yet everyone in the congregation understood precisely what Reverend Ashworth was attempting to communicate, that judgment belonged to God rather than to man, that families were fragile things requiring compassion and understanding, that the weakness of one member need not define the character of all. Miss Marple found herself reflecting, as she listened to the familiar words of the Christmas liturgy, upon the curious way in which violence disrupted the surface of village life while simultaneously revealing the depths beneath. Thomas Ashworth sat in a cell awaiting trial, his youth and charm having availed him nothing against the weight of evidence and witness testimony. The vicar and his wife sat in their customary pew, their faces bearing the particular exhaustion of those who had discovered their son capable of serious transgression. And somewhere in the village, Edward and Charlotte Blackwood were beginning the difficult work of rebuilding a marriage that had been exposed as fundamentally fractured. On the morning after Christmas, Inspector Graves called upon Miss Marple at Thornfield to present her with a formal commendation for her assistance in resolving the case. It was a gesture that seemed to cause him considerable discomfort, as though acknowledging a woman's superior deductive abilities represented some fundamental affront to his professional standing. "The case against Mr. Ashworth is quite solid," he informed her, accepting the tea that Ruth had insisted upon offering. "His fingerprints match those found upon the rock, and Mrs. Blackwood has provided testimony that clearly establishes his guilt. The Crown Solicitor believes a conviction is assured. I wanted to thank you personally, Miss Marple, for your invaluable assistance in preventing a grave miscarriage of justice. You are kind to acknowledge my small contribution," Miss Marple replied, though her tone suggested she was not entirely convinced of the inspector's sincerity. "Though I confess I find myself troubled by a remaining detail, a small inconsistency that has continued to nag at my perception." Inspector Graves set down his teacup with deliberate care, his expression suggesting he was bracing himself for criticism. "What inconsistency might that be?" "The matter of the wedding ring," Miss Marple said quietly. "I inquired earlier whether Charlotte was wearing her wedding ring when discovered." "You indicated that it was not found upon her person. Yet Charlotte has worn that ring continuously since her marriage. Why would she remove it precisely when meeting with her lover?" The question hung in the air between them, and Miss Marple perceived the moment when the inspector grasped the significance of what she was suggesting. "You believe," he said slowly, "that the ring was removed by someone else?" "I believe," Miss Marple corrected, "that Charlotte's wedding ring may provide evidence of considerable interest to anyone examining the scene with sufficient care. A ring removed in violence would likely bear scratches, would likely be found in close proximity to the scene of the assault. But if the ring was removed with deliberation, with intention, by someone who wished Charlotte to appear unmarried, then the narrative shifts considerably." Graves's face had begun to redden. "Are you suggesting that there is some element of this crime that remains unresolved?" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple said with the particular gentleness that characterized her most devastating observations, that crimes of passion are rarely as simple as they initially appear, that the human heart is capable of surprising complexity, and that solutions which seem elegant and complete often contain within them the seeds of future complications. She set down her teacup with the finality of someone concluding a conversation. "I would recommend, Inspector, that you conduct a more thorough examination of Mr. Ashworth's possessions, particularly those items retrieved from his room. A missing wedding ring represents evidence, and evidence, as you well know, often tells a story quite different from the one we initially assume." After Inspector Graves had departed, his composure somewhat ruffled and his certainty considerably diminished, Ruth emerged from the adjoining room where she had evidently been on eavesdropping with her usual determination to involve herself in matters of intrigue. "Jane," she said, settling herself beside her cousin with unconcealed curiosity, "what is it that you perceive regarding Charlotte's wedding ring? Surely you cannot believe that Thomas Ashworth—" "I believe," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that there are aspects of this crime that Thomas Ashworth himself may not fully comprehend. That human motivation is often layered in ways that those motivated themselves do not perceive." She rose and moved toward the window, gazing out toward the frost-covered grounds where the violence had erupted. Thomas Ashworth struck Charlotte Blackwood because he was enraged by her rejection, because his pride had been wounded, because his ambitions had been thwarted. All of this is true. But I suspect that the removal of her wedding ring suggests a different motivation existed as well. The motivation of someone who wished Charlotte to appear unattached, to appear available, to appear as though she might be convinced to leave her husband. Ruth's eyes widened as she grasped the implication. "You believe that Thomas intended—" "I believe," Miss Marple said, "that Thomas Ashworth harbored fantasies of winning Charlotte back, of convincing her to abandon her marriage and flee with him. The violence erupted when he perceived that these fantasies were impossible, when Charlotte definitively rejected him. But the removal of the ring suggests that he had, until the moment of violence, been entertaining the possibility of success." As evening descended and the Christmas lights twinkled throughout the village, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the particular tragedy of young men like Thomas Ashworth, men whose ambitions exceeded their circumstances, whose romantic fantasies collided violently with the reality of the world around them. The crime would be PR. Prosecuted, the conviction would be achieved, and justice, in its imperfect way, would be served. But the deeper questions regarding desire, regarding the nature of love and loss, regarding the ways in which human beings constructed narratives about their own lives, these questions would remain, as they always did, fundamentally unanswered. The discovery of Charlotte's wedding ring came precisely as Miss Marple had anticipated, found among Thomas Ashworth's possessions during a second, more thorough examination of his room at the vicarage. Inspector Graves presented himself at Thornfield once more, his expression now mingling gratitude with the particular irritation of a man forced to acknowledge that his initial investigation had been considerably less comprehensive than professional pride demanded. The ring was hidden beneath the floorboards of his room, Graves explained, laying the delicate gold band upon the table before Miss Marple with the reverence due to crucial evidence. "Had it not been for your suggestion, we should never have discovered it. The question now becomes, why would he remove it? What purpose could such an action serve?" Miss Marple lifted the ring and examined it carefully, noting the initials inscribed upon the inner surface and the slight wear patterns that suggested long and consistent use. "The answer," she said quietly, "lies in understanding what Mr. Ashworth believed he might accomplish. A woman wearing a wedding ring presents herself as married, as committed, as unavailable. Remove that ring, and one removes a visible symbol of that commitment. In Mr. Ashworth's mind, he may have believed that by removing the ring, he was somehow removing the marriage itself." Ruth, who had positioned herself with characteristic determination to observe the proceedings, made a small sound of understanding. He was attempting to remake reality through the removal of symbols. How remarkably foolish. "Not foolish," Miss Marple corrected gently, "merely desperate." Desperation often leads us to believe that small actions might achieve impossible results, that if we remove the visible evidence of something, we might somehow remove the thing itself. Mr. Ashworth removed Charlotte's ring in the belief that it might somehow change her mind, that it might convince her that her marriage was not real, not binding, not insurmountable. Inspector Graves rose and began to pace the drawing room with the agitated movements of someone grappling with uncomfortable realizations. This suggests premeditation of a different sort than we initially established. He did not simply encounter Mrs. Blackwood and strike her in a moment of passion. He planned to remove her ring. He anticipated that he might somehow convince her to leave with him. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, and when his attempt at persuasion proved unsuccessful, when Charlotte refused to be moved by his declarations, the fantasy collapsed into violence. But the existence of the ring, the deliberate removal and concealment of it, provides evidence of Mr. Ashworth's state of mind in those final moments before the attack. She set the ring upon the table with careful precision. "What we are observing, Inspector, is the behavior of a young man whose grip upon reality had become increasingly tenuous. He had constructed an elaborate fantasy regarding his future with Charlotte Blackwood, a fantasy so compelling that when she rejected him, the collapse of that fantasy transformed into genuine rage. The implications of this assessment seemed to trouble Graves considerably. Are you suggesting that Mr. Ashworth's culpability might be diminished by evidence of mental instability? That he might claim diminished responsibility?" "I am suggesting nothing of the sort," Miss Marple replied with tea. "The firmness of someone accustomed to being misunderstood. Mr. Ashworth is quite capable of standing trial for his actions. His mental state, however disordered, does not erase the fact that he struck another human being with intent to cause serious harm. What I am suggesting is that the removal of the ring provides us with insight into his character, his capacity for self-deception, his willingness to engage in fantasy rather than accept reality." After Graves had departed, considerably more subdued than upon his arrival, Ruth turned to Miss Marple with an expression of mingled appreciation and exasperation. "You could have simply allowed him to close the case with his original theory," she observed. "He would have been satisfied. Thomas Ashworth would still be convicted, and you would have avoided the necessity of these additional complications." "But the truth would have remained obscured," Miss Marple replied. "And in my experience, obscured truths have a distressing habit of manifesting themselves in unexpected ways. Better to illuminate the full complexity of a crime than to allow partial understanding to masquerade as complete knowledge." She rose and moved toward the window, where the winter sun cast long shadows across the frost-covered gardens. "Thomas Ashworth will spend a considerable portion of his life in prison for the violence he committed. But understanding the precise nature of his delusion, the specific pathways his mind traveled toward violent action, these things matter. They matter for the trial, certainly, but they also matter for the broader question of justice and comprehension that society must grapple with." Over the following days, as Christmas faded and the New Year approached, the village of Little Brackenham began the slow process of integrating the crime into its collective memory. The shock and scandal that had dominated conversation gradually subsided, replaced by the ordinary concerns of winter maintenance, January's financial reckoning, and the resumption of normal social patterns. Miss Marple observed all of this with her characteristic detachment, noting how quickly human societies moved past violence to restore themselves to functionality. The vicar and his wife began tentative efforts at reconciliation with the broader community, their son's crime gradually transmuting from active scandal into historical fact. Edward and Charlotte Blackwood made a deliberate show of being seen together in public, attending services together, hosting dinner parties together, performing the rituals of marital commitment with the careful precision of actors in a play. It was Edward who approached Miss Marple on the morning of the 31st of December, as she sat in the morning room preparing to depart Thornfield and return to her own cottage in St. Mary Mead. "I wanted to thank you personally," he said, "not merely for solving the crime, but for understanding the complexity of human motivation that lay beneath it. Your insights have helped both Charlotte and myself to navigate the difficulties of our marriage with greater compassion than we might otherwise have managed." "You are kind to acknowledge this," Miss Marple replied, "though I suspect the true work of reconciliation has only just begun. Marriages that survive violence often discover that the violence has revealed truths that cannot be unknown, cannot be set aside. You and Charlotte must now decide whether you wish to build a new marriage upon the foundation of these truths, or whether the damage is too extensive for genuine restoration." "We have decided," Edward said quietly, "to attempt the former. It will not be easy. There will be moments of doubt, moments when the memory of Charlotte's involvement with Thomas threatens to overwhelm us. But we have both determined that the alternative, dissolution, bitterness, estrangement, is unacceptable. As Miss Marple departed Thornfield Manor on the first day of the new year, traveling in Ruth's automobile toward her own cottage, she found herself reflecting upon the curious way in which violence had served as the mechanism through which truth emerged in Little Brackenham. The crime itself was tragic, the damage to Charlotte irreversible in certain ways, the young man's life forever altered by his moment of rage. Yet from this tragedy had come possibilities for genuine understanding, for authentic connection, for the hard work of building relationships based upon honest acknowledgement of human weakness rather than careful maintenance of convenient fictions. It was, she reflected, one of the paradoxes of human existence, that destruction sometimes preceded reconstruction, that violence sometimes cleared away the debris of pretense to reveal the possibility of genuine intimacy beneath. The winter of that year proved to be one of the coldest in memory, snow falling heavily throughout January and into February, transforming the English countryside into a landscape of white stillness. Miss Marple remained in her cottage in St. Mary Mead, attending to the small matters that occupied the lives of elderly ladies in quiet villages, correspondence with friends, the maintenance of her garden during the brief respites between snowfalls, and the careful observation of her own community's dramas, which, while less dramatic than the violence that had disrupted Little Brackenham, possessed their own subtle complexities. It was in early February that Sergeant Willis arrived at her door, his uniform bearing the marks of hurried travel, his expression suggesting that he carried news of considerable importance. Miss Marple received him in her sitting room, settling him with tea and the small cakes that her housekeeper had prepared, noting with quiet satisfaction that the young man possessed at least sufficient wisdom to recognize that important matters were often best discussed with proper ceremony. "I come bearing a confession," Willis began, once the initial formalities had been observed. "Or rather, I come bearing the revelation of a fact that Inspector Graves and I have determined you should know, though it remains unclear whether it will ever be presented in court." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care, her attention sharpening. "Please continue," she said. "During the more thorough examination of Mr. Ashworth's possessions, we discovered not only Mrs. Blackwood's wedding ring, but also a journal kept by Mr. Ashworth throughout his time in London. In that journal, he documented his growing obsession with Charlotte, his fantasies regarding their future together, and, most significantly, his conviction that she had betrayed him by marrying Edward Blackwood." Willis paused, consulting a small notebook he had extracted from his pocket. The entries became increasingly disturbing as the weeks progressed. He wrote of following her, of observing her movements, of planning ways in which he might reclaim her, as he phrased it. And there are entries suggesting that he had intended, when he returned to the village, to engineer circumstances that would force Charlotte to choose between her husband and himself. And the attack, Miss Marple prompted gently, represented the culmination of this elaborate fantasy? Precisely. According to the journal, Mr. Ashworth had written extensively about the moment when Charlotte would finally acknowledge her true feelings for him, when she would abandon her marriage and flee with him to begin a new life. The journal entry written on the morning of the attack reveals a man whose grasp on reality had become extremely tenuous. He genuinely believed that if he could somehow separate Charlotte from her ring, from the symbol of her commitment to Edward, he might convince her to leave her husband. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the calm of someone for whom such revelations merely confirmed suspicions already formed. and when confronted with Charlotte's refusal. "The journal does not continue beyond the morning of the attack," Willis said. "But based on the evidence and Mrs. Blackwood's testimony, it appears that Mr. Ashworth experienced what can only be described as a psychotic break. The fantasy he had constructed for so long proved so incompatible with reality that when reality refused to conform to his expectations, he responded with violence. Has Inspector Graves considered whether mental examination might be advisable?" Miss Marple inquired. "He has," Willis confirmed. "A psychiatrist has been engaged to evaluate Mr. Ashworth's mental state. The Crown Solicitor is uncertain whether to pursue charges as originally conceived, or whether to recommend psychiatric evaluation and treatment instead of traditional imprisonment. It is, I'm afraid, a matter that exceeds my own capacity for legal judgment." After Willis had departed, bearing Miss Marple's thanks and the assurance that she would respect the confidential nature of his disclosure, the elderly detective sat alone in her sitting room, her knitting forgotten in her lap, as she contemplated the full scope of the tragedy that had unfolded in Little Brackenham. What had initially presented itself as a crime of passion rooted in immediate jealousy had revealed itself to be something far more complicated, an elaborate fantasy constructed over months of obsessive thinking, a gradual dissolution of the boundary between imagination and reality, a young man's capacity for self-deception finally overwhelming his ability to distinguish between what he wished to be true and what actually was. Thomas Ashworth would spend years in either prison or psychiatric facilities, his youth and potential sacrificed to the particular cruelties of an imagination unmoored from reality. The vicar and his wife would carry the burden of their son's actions for the remainder of their lives, their reputation irrevocably altered by his violence. Edward and Charlotte Blackwood would continue the difficult work of rebuilding their marriage, forever marked by the knowledge of what had transpired and what had been revealed about themselves and each other through that violence. And Miss Marple, who had unravelled the threads of the mystery with her characteristic precision, would return to her quiet life in St. Mary Mead, carrying with her the accumulated wisdom of a woman who had learned, across nearly a century of observation, that human nature was capable of both remarkable beauty and terrible destruction, often simultaneously. The snow continued to fall outside her window as the winter deepened, covering the village in layers of white silence. In the hospital some miles away, Charlotte Blackwood continued her recovery, her physical wounds healing while the psychological damage of the attack remained a matter of ongoing concern. In the prison awaiting trial, Thomas Ashworth occupied his cell with the particular horror of a man beginning to comprehend the full scope of his delusion and the consequences that delusion had wrought. The case that had consumed the attention of Little Brackenham for nearly 3 weeks had become, by February, merely history. Tragic history, to be sure, but history nonetheless. The village had moved forward with the resilience that small communities possessed, the ordinary rhythms of life reasserting themselves over the disruption of violence. Yet Miss Marple knew, as she always did, that violence was never truly concluded, never truly resolved. It echoed forward through time, altering the trajectories of all those it touched, creating consequences that extended far beyond the initial moment of transgression. The mystery might be solved, the criminal apprehended, the truth illuminated. But the deeper questions regarding human motivation, human weakness, human capacity for self-deception remained, as they always would, fundamentally mysterious. It was this recognition, that complete understanding remained forever beyond reach, that human behavior possessed depths that rational analysis could never entirely plumb, that had sustained Miss Marple throughout her long life of observation and deduction. For in accepting the limits of her own knowledge, she had discovered something far more valuable than certainty. She had discovered humility, and with it, the capacity to regard even the darkest human actions with something approaching compassion.